Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. When we think of slavery, most of us imagine overcrowded Atlantic ships hauling human cargo to a cruel plantation economy in the United States and the Caribbean. But slavery was practiced in the Islamic world for much longer. It dates back to the 7th century and endured openly until the late 20th century. Hereditary slavery still exists in Mali and Mauritania, and the Arab states have the highest prevalence of forced labor in the world today. Why do we know so little about this, and what forms did it take? Today's guest set out to answer these questions and more in a compelling new book that traces the extraordinary variety of slavery in the Islamic world and brings life to voices of enslaved people from 8th century concubines to 20th century pearl divers. Justin Marozzi is the author of Captives and Companions, A History of Slavery and the Slave Trade in the Islamic World, and of Islamic Empires, 15 Cities That Define a Civilization, and an excellent biography of Tamerlane. We spoke about courtesans and slave soldiers, the trans-Saharan slave trade, and how the Quran addressed slavery. This is Justin's second appearance on the podcast. We talked about Tamerlane in episode 38, so go back and check that out if you haven't heard it already. One last thing before we jump in. Personal Landscapes relies on the support of listeners like you to keep going. If you want to keep it paywall-free and ad-free, please consider joining the Members Club. You'll support the show and get cool book lover bonuses for what it would cost to buy a fancy coffee once a month. Go to personallandscapespodcast.com, where you'll find exclusive content like reading lists from my guests, long-form articles, including my latest, What I Learned from Paul Theroux, regular videos by me, and more. And now, here's my latest conversation with Justin Marozzi. So I think we should start with the obvious question. Why tackle this topic? Didn't it feel like you were walking into a political minefield?
It's funny, Ryan, that you should say that, because I did spend about 4 years on this project, during which friends would regularly say, "Oh, that's a bit brave," or "That's reckless," or, "Are you sure?" And I think I'm almost the only one to not find it at all controversial, because from a historian's point of view, this is an incredible story. And I just think in the West, when the word slavery or slave trade are mentioned, almost inevitably and universally, we think of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery in the antebellum South and in the Caribbean. And I've always been aware of the slave trade and slavery in the Islamic world from the time of my first book, which was Crossing the Libyan Sahara, along slave routes. And that was about 25 years ago, and it exposed me to some of those early 19th century explorers and travelogues with their eyewitness accounts of slave caravans passing them, the cruelty that the African slaves were enduring. And so I knew that, I knew some of the background. That was just the Sahara. But, throughout the Islamic world, obviously, the slavery has been a constant. Regrettably, it survives into the 21st century. So I think there are sensitivities. I'm not going to say that it's an entirely uncontroversial project. I just felt that as a historian, it was a story that has been quite limited to the academic world or treatment by subject. So, for example, books on harems and concubines, books on eunuchs, books perhaps on slavery in the Ottoman Empire, but not the whole, the larger picture, which is what I've tried to do, covering it from really more or less the time of the Prophet Muhammad or even a little bit earlier, the cusp of Islam originating on the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century through to the 21st century. And it's a very long, rich, often harrowing story. But I think, as a history, it felt a good time to try to grasp it and understand it and tell it and excavate some of those very elusive, lost voices.
So you said that we know so much about the Atlantic slave trade and plantation slavery in the U.S. So why is the Islamic slave trade so little known?
I think that's quite a difficult one to answer, but I think there are a number of things I feel about that. One is a little bit of Western parochialism, and I think in recent years that's become even more pronounced, so that you almost have the sense that only Western North Americans and Europeans were responsible for slavery and the slave trade, which is just completely profoundly inaccurate and ahistorical. And I think so. That's one reason. I think parochialism. It reminds me of when I was at university many years ago, and I read history there, and one of the papers was literally called "The West and the Rest." You did your North American, you did your European, and you did one pre-1750 paper of classical Rome or ancient Greeks, and if you wanted to look anywhere beyond that, you did a paper called "The West and the Rest." And it wasn't that long ago that a Cambridge historian, Hugh Trevor Roper, made a very derogatory remark about African history, completely dismissing it out of hand as a subject, unworthy of study, but in more racist language than that. And I think another thing, Ryan, I'm pretty sure, is sensitivities on the one hand of Western historians not wanting to maybe cause offense or write something that it may be seen in some quarters as critical or derogatory towards Islam and Islamic civilization. And I think another reason would be the lack of recognition within the Islamic world itself. I mean, in terms of talking about coming to terms with slavery and the legacy, and in the West, again, we're used to talking about reparations, and the UK has been under a lot of pressure from Caribbean nations on the reparations. It's involved the royal family as well. But that is a world away already from, I think, almost anywhere I can think of in the Arab and Muslim world, where it's really not a thing. I mean, in Turkey, there are some descendants of African slaves who've been lobbying hard for greater recognition and talk about the cruelty of their ancestors' treatment in the Ottoman Empire. There's one or two museums. There's a museum opened recently in Doha, but it puts a very strong positive gloss on it, and it talks about the great role Islamic civilization played in bringing humanity to enslavement and that sort of stuff. It's not really what I would call a proper reckoning with the legacy of the slave trade. So I think that's another reason why we don't hear so much about it. I think what was interesting for me during the research was coming across a new, much younger generation of scholars, especially in Turkey, but also in North Africa, especially Tunisia, Algeria, in Libya, who are fascinated by the subject of slavery and are investigating it, and Morocco as well, where it is quite taboo, actually. So early stages, but I think a new generation is starting to make inroads into this and looking at it. And I always remember one comment, really interesting, from a young Turkish historian I met. And she said she was doing a PhD or wanting to select one. And she said to her supervisor, I want to look into Ottoman slavery. And he said, my dear, our ancestors treated their slaves well. You don't need to worry about this. It's not a subject. It's not something to study. Next question, please.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I think the thing that shocked me the most in reading your book is how long this went on. Like, as you mentioned, the slavery was abolished in the U.S. in 1865, but it was only officially abolished in Iran in 1928, in Yemen and Saudi Arabia in 1962, 1964 in Turkey, 1970 in Oman, and 1981 in Mauritania. And you said that hereditary slavery persists in both Mali and Mauritania today.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting and good point, and it is shocking. Those last two countries you mentioned, I really bookended this history with a prologue coming from Mali, where I met. It was probably the most difficult interview and harrowing interview I've ever had, with a man who'd escaped his enslavement with his 2 wives and 12 children, but there was no great joy or a sense of relief, even, because he was at rock bottom. He was crying hysterically, sobbing, saying, look at my predicament. This shelter we're in now, we're about to be kicked out of. I've got no money. I can't provide for my family. I'm illiterate, so I can't do any work, office work, and I'm too old to do heavy work. And he was just sobbing. And he said how he'd been beaten in public, and that when he tried to oppose his master and say, I'm not doing this anymore, they just sort of laughed at him and started whipping and beating him, said, you're a slave, that's where you are. And he said when people have tried to sort of voice opposition to it, the owners typically say, these are our traditions, this is our custom. Who are you, or who's anyone else, especially not Westerners, to tell us you can't have slavery? These are the customs of our ancestors. So that was Mali. And then Mauritania, as you say, officially abolishing it in 1981. But, I was there in summer of 24. And is one of the most unpleasant places I think I've visited in terms of the police and surveillance, people following you everywhere, very suspicious about what I was doing. And, you don't want to be endangering the people you're talking to. I mean, most people I was talking to were connected with anti-slavery activism, and they were already under a lot of surveillance themselves, but were very keen that the story should be shared. And there I met a really remarkable woman who again had escaped her enslavement. She too came from a family of enslaved men and women, and her brother had rescued her with an activist and a policeman. But it was caught on camera back in 2008, and you see these extraordinary scenes where she is shouting at them to leave and that she is not a slave, because she said she'd been so sort of institutionalized and she was terrified that what they were doing was going to get her unbelievable, beating and punishment. So she lied to her brother and policeman, said, I'm a member of this family. I'm not a slave at all. And they virtually had to kidnap her and hustle her into a truck. And she broke down. And all these years later, she's now an incredibly strong, resilient woman who campaigns against slavery in Mauritania. And she stood for parliament several times. But the sad thing is, I think she would never get elected because it's an extremely corrupt political system. But her spirit is strong, and she wants this story told. And slavery should have no place in the 21st century, but it still remains, admittedly, very declining numbers, but it still exists in Mauritania. And everyone I spoke to there said the reason it still persists is because the establishment, the ruling class, the wealthy, these are the people with slaves, which is extraordinary.
So you trace the roots of the story to the 7th century, a little earlier. So how does the Quran address slavery?
That's also really interesting because it says a number of things about slavery. One of the first things it says, or one of the most important verses, it says, Allah has favored some of you over others in provision. And scholars have generally interpreted that to mean that it's accepted as an institution. And it makes sense as well that when a new religion is being promulgated across initially the Arabian Peninsula, it was not seeking to be too revolutionary. It was billed as really a return to the true religion, the one true faith, Abrahamic religion, and the revealed word of God to the Prophet Muhammad. So there's an acceptance that it exists. The idea of abolishing it would have made the religion a new religion, a non-starter for people who had been used to generations of slavery. So the pagan Arabs had it, the Byzantines next to them had it, the ancient Persians had it as well, of course. So there was nothing really unusual about that. But I think what the combination of both the Quran and the example of the Prophet Muhammad did to change things was to really make it a more humane institution, a very strong encouragement for the humane treatment of slaves, and very much a strong encouragement to liberate them. So you earn sort of your spiritual brownie points by redeeming, manumitting, liberating your slave, which the Prophet Muhammad did on repeated occasions, and that's always been seen as a great deed in itself. You've got Islamic law as well. We may come on to that later, but it's like, for me, felt like a triangle of the hadith, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, the Quran, and then Islamic law together form this pretty strong body of law and tradition as to how slavery is to be regulated. Is it permissible to have sex with a female slave? Yes, it is. Can a woman do that? A free Arab woman do that with her own male slave? Absolutely not. And these things are tested, and tradition just gets more and more institutionalized, and as I say, regulated throughout. But yeah, the Quran legitimates, justifies slavery, and does not seek to abolish it, but enjoins compassionate treatment of your slaves. And they have the sort of quasi-legal right to complain if they're being treated unfairly, and there are numerous instances of that, and especially you see that in the 19th century.
So you wrote that a person could become a slave in two ways. They could be born into it or captured in war. How did the Islamic conquests alter the concept of slavery?
Yes, those conquests, which took place from around say the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 to 750, the end of the great Umayyad dynasty headquartered in Damascus, and the arrival of the Abbasids, from their capital in Baghdad. That's 118 years of really lightning conquests and the enslavement of huge numbers of people, left, right, and center from the Iberian Peninsula right across North Africa, Afghanistan, Central Asia, the Levant. So a lot of those people would sent back to Damascus as slaves as well, and there's some extraordinary numbers. Tens of thousands sent back from the Iberian Peninsula as gifts back to the caliph and the caliph's court and the royal family, the headquarters of the Islamic world back in Damascus, used for all sorts of purposes. Women, I think, would be African slaves, which come a little bit later, would be primarily domestic slaves, and that probably would be the most, I'd say, for the historian, frustratingly, the least is known about that. You hear references here and there in the sources about a slave in the background, but you know nothing about their lives, what they did. But we can kind of guess that these are domestic services. Even that lady in Mauritania that I referred to a moment ago, she was looking after the goats, taking the animals out all day, coming back, cleaning the house, looking after the children, feeding them, etc., etc. So the sort of menial domestic tasks, concubines as well. Eunuchs, probably something we get on to later, different category again. Slave soldiers, again, a different category. So I think this is one of the things that I think fascinated me most about the story of slavery in the Islamic world is the sheer variety of it. And again, when we go back to what we know about the Atlantic slave trade and work on a plantation in the US South and the Caribbean, steaming plantations and terrible backbreaking work, that's just really a small part of it in the Islamic world. There is certainly plantation slavery as well, but it's a much, much broader picture. Slave soldiers, eunuchs, concubines, all the corsairing in the Mediterranean, pearl divers, agricultural workers in the Sahara, people working with dates, cloves, copra production, coconuts, cotton, and it's just a breathtaking variety of forms of enslavement. And I think that started in the earliest days as well, as you say, the enslavement by conquest.
So you quote some pretty shocking documents in your book, and the one that really stuck in my mind is an Arabic language book by an Nestorian Christian entitled How to Buy a Great Slave and Live Your Best Life. He gives tips for how to avoid being taken in by unscrupulous slave dealers and which women make the best sexual partners, and he is particularly nasty about the Zanj women. So you must have come across some really shocking documents and accounts, but this was so matter of fact and like how to live your best life. It's really amazing.
It is that's an extraordinary book, and as you say, he was a Christian as well. So although this is about slavery within the Islamic world, I think the wealthy, the establishment, they were all invested in this system as well. He happened to be a Christian, and it's literally a guidebook. How unscrupulous traders might dress up a woman to make her look something that she isn't, faking certain things. And he cautions against people buying on impulse because they get sexually aroused, and use your head, be careful. And it's also treating people like produce, like property, which is what they were legally as well, because a slave was legal property in the Islamic world. Although it was prohibited for slaves to own slaves themselves or to own property, in many cases, and you see this particularly in the Ottoman Empire, where I think our understanding of the definition of slavery is really stretched beyond breaking point. You have slaves of the Sultan with huge numbers of slaves themselves. But then, to put that into perspective, I'd say that virtually everyone who worked for the Sultan throughout the empire was officially a slave of the Sultan. But that didn't prohibit them from amassing great wealth. These were very powerful individuals, officials. Even a chief eunuch could be a sort of equivalent of a multi-millionaire today, but officially a slave. I think also that you're talking about sort of documents that were shocking. Some of the Arab writers across the Middle Ages, I'm thinking of people like Masudi, Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Sina, Jahiz, wrote about Black Africans in a way which I doubted whether we would be able to reproduce those in the book, in 21st century publishing. And I'm pleased to say, but I was relieved that we weren't, we were allowed to reproduce some of these great works of Arab literature, but they are peppered with incredibly racist descriptions of Africans, both men and women, physical characteristics, talking about, disparagingly about their Africans' love of music and dancing. And these were commonplace views. They weren't fringe writers. I think that's again what interested me. These were not random writers. These were really giants of Arab intellectual thinking, great writers. I mean, people like Jahiz Ibn Sina, Avicenna, the founder of modern medicine, Ibn Khaldun, the father of sociology, Masudi, known as the Herodotus of the Arabs. But when they wrote about Black Africans, these extraordinary stereotypes were very much in evidence. And I think that in some parts of the Arab world, that has certainly persisted to this day. And I'm thinking about a time when I was in Libya during the revolution in 2011, and some revolutionaries that I was sitting with just called out one of their party and just called him abd, slave, as a joke. And they said, "Oh, it's just a name. It's nothing. It's just a joke." But that was their view of it. It wasn't his view of it. He looked pretty upset about it, but was used to being treated as differently because he had darker skin and an African ancestry. So I do think some of those attitudes still certainly persist. And Libya actually, it's known to be a particular problem towards those Libyans of African origin are routinely treated, with a significant degree of racism.
Where do you think that attitude comes from? Like, how much of it in Libya, for example, is shaped by Libya's history as a center of the desert slave trade, or does it predate that, this prejudice against darker-skinned Africans?
Well, I just remember that, when there was a time when Gaddafi had tried to, be the leader of the Arab world. His fellow Arab leaders didn't particularly welcome that, and then he sort of suddenly said, we're all African, and most Libyans would talk to you about Africans as though they're not African. We're different. We're a superior caste. We're paler skin. We're Arabs. Whereas if you just look at a map, if Libyans aren't African, what are they? But it's a deep sort of prejudice towards the darker skinned people. I think part of that is historical, that from the 7th century and those conquests we mentioned a moment ago, there was that great movement of people across the North African littoral and further south as well. So, and they were paler skinned Arabs, but they also encountered Berbers in the north, and the sub-Saharan Africans came in or were enslaved and brought north. And I think so from a very early stage were considered to be inferior to the Arabs, who were sort of, kings and queens of the world, this superior civilization. So I think there's a strong historical reason for that. And then, as you say, that the tradition of the Saharan slave trade, more or less the only Black Africans Libyans would have seen for hundreds and hundreds of years would be those being taken, having been probably quite brutally raided from their homes in sub-Saharan Africa, trafficked north in really very inhumane conditions on those long Saharan slave caravan marches, which were death traps as well for huge numbers of people.
So I want to come on to those various spheres of slavery later, but first I want to talk about some of the institutions. You mentioned the multiple forms of servitude that encompassed, both genders, all ages, many ethnicities. I want to look at a couple of those categories. First of all, courtesans. Courtesans seem to sit at the top of a sort of hierarchy. That's the impression I get.
I think that's true, and I think a lot of historians would say, that this is like kind of elite slavery because the numbers are smaller. I mean, your average Muslim, Christian, or Jew throughout most of this period is not going to be able to, or a man we're talking about first of all, it would not be able to afford to have a concubine in his house. So you're immediately talking about sort of ruling families, royal families, maybe provincial noble families as well, governors and things like that. But so it's a very elite, scenario we're talking about. And then you also have on top of that, then you have a sort of an ethnic dimension to it. So again, both Arabs and Ottomans after them would typically prefer paler skinned women as their concubines. So that meant either Arab women or those from the Caucasus, especially for the Ottomans, the Georgians, Circassians. And so they were more prized, they were more costly. I think in the earlier days of the caliphate, it would interested me some of those stories from the Abbasid era, where you have these incredibly strong, interesting, compelling women who left really strong traces in the sources. There were three I focused on in one chapter. A woman called Arab, for example, who I think confessed that she slept with 8 different caliphs in the course of her life. And she was once asked, I think she was, I think in her 90s or something like that. We don't know, the full details, but she was asked what she looked for in a lover, and she said a hard prick and sweet breath. And it's just a kind of extraordinary thing coming out from over 1,000 years in history. This strong voice. But I think what's also interesting about them as well, typically we would just say, oh, they were there for sex, and that was it. And I think that's kind of a peculiarly Western view of it. That was absolutely part of it, but it was by no means all of it. And so these women, the most elite ones, again, who were prized by the caliphs and were frankly kind of traded like Premiership footballers these days for huge, staggering amounts of money and auctioned sometimes, were fantastically talented. They were great singers. They could memorize thousands of different verses. Some of them were particularly good musicians. Some were poets. And there were these, I think they call it verse capping. It doesn't really sound like something we would know, but maybe the equivalent of a poetry slam today, where it's confrontational, it's competitive, and you'd have 2 women squaring off against each other. And the caliph would say half of a verse, and then they would have to extemporize the remaining couplet to make it rhyme, make it scan formally. So, incredibly dexterous intellectually as well. And this is all sort of celebrated as well. So it's much more than being, an attractive sexual partner. And I think that's an interesting part of it as well. And another interesting thing I think for me with this, as it was with a number of other categories, is the sheer longevity of the concubines. So the last king of Morocco, the father of the current king of Morocco, had a harem of concubines, and there's a very interesting memoir written by a woman called La Prisonnière, who spent years in an underground prison in the Sahara, and she grew up as a playmate of one of the king's children. And there were court slaves. There were slaves to administer punishment. There were slaves to produce hashish. There were slaves as domestic duties. There were slave concubines, and this was in the 20th century. So concubines, I always seen them as the sort of the sister category to eunuchs, but they're coterminous with the entire history of Islam. So from the birth of Islam, you've got concubines virtually to this day. I mean, who knows whether they have them in Saudi Arabia today, but they certainly did until pretty recently. And the same would be true of eunuchs again.
One story that stuck in my mind too was the story of Inan. And she was a remarkable character that you wrote about, one of the 3 that you mentioned earlier, and a very lewd poet as well. So did you find like examples of her poetry in the documents?
Yeah, I looked at Inan's work in almost exclusively in translation, really, which immediately, you're at one significant remove from the richness of the Arabic language, and I think that obviously suffers in translation, but for its sheer sort of bawdiness and risque humor, I think she takes a lot of beating, and she was a woman who was wronged in love, had tussles with some of the most famous people of her era. She had a very tempestuous love affair with one of the great poets of his era, and a great poet in Arab poetry to this day, Mutanabi. There's a street named after him in Baghdad to this day. And he ridiculed her in one of his poems when the relationship was foundering, and she was sort of humiliated, but fought back very bitterly as well. And you have this incredibly strong record of poetic jousts from these 2 strong, irrepressible characters. And for a woman, even much more brave than for a man to be fighting back in public like that when your reputation is all you have. She was an incredibly strong character. And I think the sheer fact that these individuals have come down to us through history, 1,300 years ago or thereabouts, is an indication of how important they were to the sort of intellectual life of the period. They were strong characters in their own right. And again, you could say they test a little bit the definition of slave. In our mind, it's possibly someone from Africa who's been shipped across to North America to work in very appalling conditions on plantations. This is a different form of slavery. Maybe you could call it, gilded cage, or a different type of enslavement. But again, strong characters who left their mark in the literary record as well.
But for every one of these kind of high society slaves who did leave their mark, the norm must have been much different than that. Like there must be so many more who lived brutally hard lives and died forgotten, whose stories we can never know today.
Yeah, I think that's totally right, Ryan. And you come across this in other historians' books, and this the word voices comes up a lot, and the how elusive the voices are. And I think that's one of the great challenges here, to try to find these voices, and they crop up in all sorts of different documents, but very few and far between, and very fragmentary. I remember coming across a book which showed I think it's the 18th century correspondence between different African slaves to each other on behalf of their masters, and they're handling this sort of smallish trading network across the Sahara and writing letters to each other. And writing letters from the owner to his slave and the slave to his owner with very respectful language, complaints about things arriving too late, questions about pricing and things. And you get a sense of, their literary ability, how cheeky or respectful they are towards their masters. But, it's really, these aren't memoirs. These are just little snippets here and there. There's another one of a stone inscription about a woman who had, we think she was a concubine of a minor royal in, I think it was Iraq or Syria. And there's just a few lines on a really a gravestone saying how that she was always scared to be away from her family. She was traveling, and so we think she might have just died away from her family, possibly alone. Sad life, no record of it whatsoever. And so you're again and again you're confronted with the quite a dearth of biographical stories, and that really only changes. Well, we've had some of the stuff we just spoke about in the Abbasid period, but again, that's elite slavery. This is not day to day average slave. That changes much more in the 19th century and the 18th century, when you start getting even memoirs for those who've been Europeans who've been captured by Muslim or ostensibly Muslim corsairs and pirates, and they write their exciting sort of I escaped from captivity narratives. But I think that the sources are tricky, and when you do come across them, you sort of fall on them greedily. One of my favorites was again a terrible story. 19th century concubine in Cairo, who had been treated incredibly badly by her owner. He'd raped her. She was pregnant. His wife was furious, beat her up to try to get her to miscarry. And again, you see what had happened to her through her deposition to the police in mid 19th century Cairo. And it's only because she was brave enough to challenge the conditions of her enslavement and her the unscrupulous behavior of her master, that we get a sense of what life could have been like and was like for many people. And then obviously you come to the conclusion that what about all those people who never complained, who never went to court, who just were too terrified to go to the police and complain? So it reminds me of when a Turkish historian I spoke to, his great great grandfather had been enslaved as a child. He went on to become the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, but he said there is a danger that you romanticize slavery in the Islamic world by assuming this was a typical story. It wasn't. It was completely unrepresentative. Most people led undocumented lives, possibly pretty cruel, possibly humane treatment. We just don't know a lot of the time, because these are not things that were written about or studied.
You had some really interesting indirect references as well in writing about the Sudanese slave trade. You said that women enslaved for sexual services were a staple for those who could afford them. But even when a man could not afford them, there were options available. And you write about a group of religious dignitaries in Khartoum who pooled their funds together to buy a woman, who was then required to sleep with her owners in descending order of precedence.
That was an extraordinary story, and it only and again we only know about that because there was a legal complaint from one of the men to the judge, because I think this woman got sick or no, sorry, I think she became pregnant, and so one of the other men who had bought her in common complained that that their goods had been sort of sullied, and it wasn't fair, and they wanted recompense from the man who'd made her pregnant. I mean, an extraordinary story, and the hypocrisy involved in men who were outwardly religious and, of a high social intellectual standing in their community to behave like this. But and again, we only know about it because that triggered a legal dispute, not from the woman in this case, but from one of the co-conspirators or the co-purchasers of this unfortunate woman.
In addition to courtesans and slave girls kept for sex or entertainment, you also wrote about slave soldiers. So how did the rulers in these regions come to rely on slave armies? Like, didn't they risk having those trained soldiers turned against themselves?
You're absolutely right. That proved to be the greatest possible risk. It's a little bit like the story of Frankenstein, who sort of grows up and devours his creator. It started pretty early on. I mean, there are slave soldiers in the Prophet Muhammad's armies in the earliest days of Islam, but it only becomes more systematic in the Abbasid period. And there'd been a civil war between two brothers, Amin and Mamun. After the civil war between the brothers, there was a recognition that in order for greater security to be imposed across the empire, the army needed to be more trustworthy. And there was a decision taken to source slave soldiers from Turkic tribes of Central Asia. So not Turks as in Turkey, but Turkic tribes from further east in Central Asia. And the reason for that was the Arabs considered them the best, the most accomplished, the physically most hardy, the most brilliant. So they were imported to sort of buttress an army of questionable loyalty back in Baghdad. And then it became a tradition. But as you say, the great risk there is that the soldiers turn on their masters. And that happened pretty quickly. I mean, by the ninth century, the caliphate had moved from Baghdad to Samarra, further up the Tigris, for security reasons. And very quickly, the Turkic soldiers, who were sort of the bodyguards, the chief entourage of the caliphs, usurped power and started assassinating caliphs, putting puppet caliphs on the throne, then removing them, often very violently, if they no longer served their purposes. So that happened as well. Also, slave soldiers become, I think the best example of them, or the most famous, would be the Mamluks. Mamluk being an Arabic word for a thing or a person who is possessed. And in that case, both in Egypt and in Iraq and Syria, the slave soldiers actually start a dynasty called the Mamluks, which is kind of an extraordinary thing. And again, it's that example of how slavery in the Islamic world can completely transcend our understanding of what the word slave means, because these are slave soldiers who suddenly become rulers, which is, I think, a pretty extraordinary thing. And there's nothing like that in the Western equivalent. And another example of distinguished slave soldiers, a little bit different in that they don't form a dynasty, but they were very strong fighting force and extremely influential, were the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire. I think probably their greatest moment was 1453, when 21-year-old Sultan Mehmet II, on the cusp of being defeated at the siege of Constantinople, which had withstood about 800 years of Arab-Muslim attacks, he finally pitched in his Janissaries, his last throw of the dice. He had a virtually mutinous army. His nobles were saying, who is this? This is a very impetuous young man. He's going to get us all ruined. And they were just about to turn against him. And with his last throw of the dice, he pitched in the Janissaries, who stormed the walls, took the city, and secured Mehmet's place in history as the conqueror of Christian Constantinople, which became Muslim Istanbul, and the Janissaries, the great slave soldiers, who were recruited as young boys from the Caucasus. So they earned their position in the great annals of Ottoman history there. So that's another example of slave soldiers. They're interesting as well because they were either forcibly captured in the Caucasus or voluntarily given over by their parents, who are hoping for sort of great career opportunities for their beautiful young son. And they think, he could, if he's good, he works hard, he trains hard, he's become Muslim, he could become a great figure in the heart of the Ottoman Empire and become a figure of great financial success.
So was there any road to freedom for these soldiers eventually, or would they die a slave when they're just fight to the end of their life and that's it?
It's not always clear, but you often come across the figure of 8 years, after which slaves were frequently manumitted. It wasn't always the case with slave soldiers, but I think it's something to bear in mind that they typically would not die in slavery. But that's not always the case though either. They still had to be manumitted. So it's always uncertain. And I mean, going back to the three women we talked about, Arab, Inan, and Mahbuba, in the early Abbasid Caliphate, it's not completely clear even now that blurring of the division between courtesan and concubine. Were they what? It's not clear they were all slave concubines. And certainly Arab was freed later in her life because she had her own retinue of slaves herself. But it's we said earlier about the incentives to liberate your slaves were strong, and they were always there. But it didn't mean that all slaves would be manumitted. That wasn't always the case at all.
So the other category I want to ask you about, and the one that seems most grotesque to us today, is eunuchs. What was the obsession with eunuchs?
Yes, eunuchs really, one of the most kind of disgusting, really, mutilations, really, physical mutilations. Muhammad himself regarded it as completely unacceptable. It was prohibited. It was the mutilation of one of God's creatures. So his views on it were known in the earliest days. I think we probably should begin by saying that, again, this was not something that Islam had invented. That eunuchs, like slaves themselves, had been fairly universal in history. The Chinese, the ancient Egyptians had used them. The Persians had them as well. But you're right, it was a bit of an obsession for a couple of reasons. I think primarily one would have been to supervise the harems of the women. So if you wanted a guard of your entourage of female concubines, you didn't want that sort of individual to be able to have sexual intercourse with them at all. So one way of stopping that would be to emasculate them. So that was a sort of a long tradition. I mean, so long, in fact, that there was an exhibition in London in 2015 of these venerable old men. They were all Ethiopians who had served their entire lives, having been castrated as young boys in Ethiopia, as guardians of the shrine of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina, Saudi Arabia. So there's this kind of fairly extraordinary irony that these castrated men, or boys who then became men, spent their decades of their lives in service over the shrine of the Prophet Muhammad, a man who had expressly prohibited castration. So I think there is that sort of tension.
So why did they insist on eunuchs for that, to guard the shrine?
That is a strange one, because clearly there's no female element there whatsoever. It's not known exactly who started that tradition. Saladin was one of two possibilities. So it was around the 12th century. It was approximately an 800-year tradition, which only ended, I think, in about 1980 or thereabouts in Saudi Arabia. So the men I talked about in 2015, these were all retired men in their 80s and 90s plus. But it's not really known why. I think there was certainly, in the Islamic world, eunuchs were also regarded, could be venerable, trusted figures. And because they were emasculated, they were no threat to other men, and certainly not to other women as well. And they could be very pious, as I say, trustworthy. So that was a tradition that started there. And as you say, a pretty unpleasant one. So I wanted to look into what it means to be made a eunuch, and some of the descriptions are really awful, as you can imagine. And there are some 19th century descriptions, primarily almost always by European explorers. So again, you have to sort of slightly filter or be aware of the Western European perspective and to what extent that's prejudiced against Muslims at the period. But they write in great detail about how these operations were done, the agony to the young boys, the mortality rate, the substances that were used to cauterize the open wound, chances of survival. It's pretty horrible stuff. And what was interesting as well is the sort of this hypocrisy about, although Islam prohibits castration, you get other people to do it in castration centers across Europe, especially monks, Christian monks in Upper Egypt, performing the operation. And then the boys get shipped into the Islamic world, and the rulers say, "Oh, look, here are some eunuchs that have been prepared for us." So rather than having it done in situ by a Muslim doctor, which would have been sort of against Islam, it's done elsewhere. They could look the other way and continue this tradition of importing eunuchs, which lasted, as I say, well into the 20th century. So when you have eunuchs serving in the Ottoman court right until it's the end of the empire in 1922.
That's really incredible.
There are concubines and eunuchs into the 20th century. It's extraordinary.
So you talked about several overlapping spheres of slavery in the book, and I want to touch on two of them here because I'm kind of familiar with those regions. So tell us about slavery in the Mediterranean. Like the West always focused on Barbary corsairs and, raids by Islamic slave traders, but you describe it as much more of a free-for-all.
Yeah, this was quite interesting as well, I found, because as you say, typically the Western view of this is exclusively Muslim pirates and corsairs preying upon exclusively white European sailors. And that's just simply not the case. I think what one thing I would say immediately is that the prevalence of Europeans among the leadership of these corsairing crews. So it's really interesting. You get sort of renegade Scots and Brits, French, or all sorts of European nationalities who essentially are sort of rogues and adventurers and thugs, thinking, I'm going to make my fortune and I'm going to base myself out of Tunis or Algiers or Tripoli. They convert to Islam, I would think, out of convenience, and they change their names to people like, Murad Rais. And even that name itself is used several times by European, they were called renegades. They turned Turk in the parlance of the time. And then they are just enslaving everything in sight. And it's interesting because it's almost colorblind, the corsairing in the Mediterranean. And there's been a lot of work done by a particularly American Lebanese historian, Nabil Matar, who kind of reminds us, be careful about, who should throw the first stone. No one comes out of the Barbary corsairing with glowing reputations. It really is a free-for-all, Muslim on Muslim, Christian on Muslim, Muslim on Jew. And I think there's a historian who called it, I think the Mediterranean is a vortex of horror, probably the worst bit of which could be if you were put onto a galley slavery, which was basically a death sentence.
So what were conditions like for a galley rower?
Well, the descriptions we have are, pretty horrible. A slave shackled to an oar day and night, never unshackled, urinating and defecating on the site, given very minimal rations, but enough to keep them going, enough to be able to row whenever needed, and just routinely whipped as well. And that would be something that, we've been talking about manumitting slaves. There was very rarely manumission from that sentence. It was typically seen as a death sentence. You were there until you were no more. So that was one of the worst aspects of this, I think, as well. But used by all sorts of powers, again, Muslim or Christian, irrespective, really.
Now, the Knights of Malta, I wrote about this in my Malta book, that became a center of corsairing in the Mediterranean, known for having some of the best dockyards, the best technology, the best weapons, and the most skilled pirate crews between Europe and Algeria. Yeah, there's a Maltese historian, Liam Kauke, who wrote about some regular Maltese citizens putting money into these slaving ventures and backing a ship for a share of the take. And even the nuns who prayed for the success of the ship got a 5% cut of the take.
I mean, extraordinary kind of, where private enterprise meets slavery and the slave trade, kind of extraordinary. As you say, including the ostensibly religious, pious, charitable people, individuals, completely extraordinary.
Yeah, it's really incredible. So the other major sphere I wanted to touch on as well was the trans-Saharan slave trade, because I crossed paths with it in Sudan. I passed through Salima Oasis on the way to Jebel Awaynat and La Aqua El Arbain, an oasis further south from Salima that was on the 40-day road. And you wrote about some of these slave routes in your first book, south from Barbary, as you spoke about. So could you give listeners a sense of the journey that sub-Saharan African slaves were forced to endure in the Sahara?
Yeah, the most detailed descriptions we have tend to be coming from the 19th century, with, I think, primarily European explorers. I mean, the book I was thinking of, which inspired my first one, was a 3-year expedition in Libya, I think the 1814, around that time, 1820s. And there are very closely observed descriptions of both slave traders and slave caravans, and how the humanity of the African slaves singing together, keeping together as a community, trying to keep up their spirits, getting very, what's the word, not injured, absolutely exhausted and being left by the wayside if you can't keep up with the slave caravan, you might sit down or lie down for rest and never get up again. You're going to die in that desert. And so there are those sorts of descriptions. Likewise, the descriptions of Arab slave traffickers whipping their enslaved men, women, and children in the desert, of raping them. There's a line from James Richardson, a 19th century English campaigner against the slave trade, who was also an evangelical Christian, who was saying that very few girls, I think under the age of 10 or something, would survive a crossing of the Sahara without having been raped. Now, again, we have to be sensitive towards the fact that this is a sort of impassioned, irascible, evangelical Christian with very strong hostile views about Muslims in general. But these are some of the descriptions we have, these eyewitness accounts, and with very high mortality rates. I'm not sure. It depends on which route you go, but we're talking about well over 1,000, maybe 1,600 miles forced march on pitiful rations, with an acceptance that a lot of the caravan wouldn't make it, and that was sort of factored into the calculations of the traders. Being driven really like cattle, while the traders rode on camels in much greater comfort, not exhausting themselves, while these poor people all around them were on foot, struggling to survive.
And would they have been taken to slave markets on the coast and sold onwards? And if so, where were they sold to?
Yeah, that's right. There would be the centers. I mean, Tripoli was one of the central ones on that coast as well, and Tunis, Algiers. A lot of would have gone mostly really across the Mediterranean. At a time when there was, slavery. Well, I suppose it depends which period we're talking about, because the period I was looking at was an entire 1,400 years. But in medieval Mediterranean, across the Mediterranean, also into Italy, southern France, but massively into the Ottoman Empire. And it's and someone also would have stayed in North Africa as well, working for the Arabs who lived on that northern coast and across the Mediterranean on different islands, and as you say, Malta included amongst that.
And you said some were also put to work in the desert itself. So what was life like for a slave who ended up in the salt mines, for example?
I think that would have been clearly was one of the most punishing things. And you have descriptions of what backbreaking work that is and was, and the damage to your skin, all the exposure to the sun, the blindness from the sunlight on the white salt. And we know that from the salt trade in more recent times, what backbreaking work that is, and how poorly paid it is. But we also know that salt was used as a currency as well, so it had considerable value. And is it No, Ibn Battuta, not Herodotus. Ibn Battuta writing about some of the salt mines and houses built of salt in the Sahara. I think that would be one of the worst. Equally, clearing out underground irrigation channels was incredibly dangerous. And there's a description, I think, again in the 19th century, of a slave being sent down to clear out this channel, and then there's I think the well falling in on him, breaking his legs. He's hauled out, and the master's response is, he'll be no. Someone said, he needs to get some medical attention or help, and the slave owner saying he's no good. He's finished. Again, it's just like, my animal's broken down. Forget it. He's gone. And how much he had cost him. Yes. I lost this much money on that particular slave. Very little compassion or humanity as well. So I think it often would depend on the sort of person who was your master or owner as to how you were treated. But that's just a tiny little vignette from one description. When they had interviews from, I think that was from the 1940s, a French interview of an elderly man who was recalling his life as a slave in a Saharan plantation.
So you close the book with a chilling chapter on modern slavery. So how widespread is slavery today in this part of the world?
I think I focused on two slightly different aspects of this. One was, because I thought it had to be included, was Daesh, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Primarily because they were so clear about what it was they were doing. They were in no way embarrassed or trying to hide the institution of slavery. They were glorifying it and saying, these are infidels, we're enslaving. It's permissible to have sex with them. It's permissible to beat them if they behave badly. And from a literalist Islamic perspective, they were on fairly solid ground. And they knew that, and they're citing religious texts to justify their practice of enslavement. But in practice, it was completely barbaric. Women were treated absolutely appallingly, and there is a legal case to this day. A lot of the people it was brought against have subsequently died in the operations against Daesh and ISIS, but it detailed in horrifying detail the conditions women were kept in, and how they were traded, abused, beaten, whipped, thrown downstairs, had their children killed, burnt with cigarettes, you name it. It's all there, the disgusting treatment. So I focused on that. And then separately, there's the story of slavery in the Gulf, which is kind of maybe more, I don't know, indentured labor or modern slavery, but the story of sort of migrants coming in and having their passports confiscated and taken, so they become, that they're forcibly kept. And there was a BBC investigation a few years ago which showed how third country nationals from places like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Africa were being traded on an app and described, this is Jamal, he's very smiley, fairly hardworking, he doesn't need to be beaten, things like, with these extraordinarily descriptions like that. So it's being traded in secret. And we know from human rights organizations that modern slavery continues to exist, and the Arab world, unfortunately, is one of the worst offenders. And places like Saudi Arabia in particular is seen as a serial offender in this respect.
So what is the kafala system?
Well, the kafala system is really when people are brought in as workers, then they are tied to that particular individual who's responsible for their immigration status. They're not free to leave and seek alternative employment. I mean, I think it has been improved in recent years, but it remains a problem in parts of the Gulf. And you can see in much of the Gulf, the people who are building the skyscrapers, serving in the hotels, the taxi drivers. I'm not saying that by any stretch of the imagination this is all modern slavery, but within the lower paid workforce, and I think more out of sight would be the ones working inside in private houses, in residence for wealthier Arab families. We know that unfortunately modern slavery continues to benight parts of the region.
I saw an example of this in Malta when I lived there. There was a company called Leisure Clothing. It was a Chinese-owned company, and they were using North Koreans. It was basically slave labor. Their passports were taken away. These North Koreans were working in this clothing factory, and the money, of course, was going back to the regime. It wasn't going to these people. And everybody knew about this. Nothing like that happens in Malta without the government knowing about it, or some minister, being in on it or having approved it. So it got shut down at the time that I was living there. But I mean, this is 7 years ago, 8 years ago.
Yeah, and it's that thing, the classic thing of the removal of the passport, and then you're stuck.
Yeah,
which is nightmarish.
So how do contemporary Muslims view this part of their history?
I suppose it would depend on who you speak to. As I said a while ago, I think there's a generational divide. I think that among an older generation, it seems to me to be the case of there's nothing to see here. Or it can be, this is an attack on Islam. This is yet again the West trying to make us look bad. And I think when looking back at the period of abolition, that really was a strong, and in many cases a justified sense, that the West was out to smash up the Islamic world. And on the one hand, when the British were the Royal Navy fighting slavery Indian Ocean on the east coast of Africa, it was also a way in to start expanding the empire along also the Trucial Coast, the Emirates of today, Oman. So there's a line in the book from, I forget which historian, but for many Arabs, abolition was imperialism spelt differently. So there is that sense as well, which I think is worth mentioning. But I think attitudes, they vary. I think in a country like Libya, I never saw anything other than denial. And I remember working there as a communications advisor when CNN broke a story that slave markets were operating in Libya, and the world was completely astonished. And as an advisor to the then government in Tripoli, I said, I think the best thing to do is to announce an immediate investigation, reaffirm your complete horror and opposition to slavery in any form whatsoever. And immediately my Libyan colleagues started talking about the hidden hand behind this, which is normally key code for Israel. possibly the United States as well. And it was immediately considered a smear against Libya, as opposed to, we better look into this and see what's happening. So I think it varies according to who you ask, from the sort of nothing to see here sense of denial to a younger generation who seem to be keener to look into it. But again, that's quite a minority view, because I'm talking about academics and historians who aren't particularly representative. I suspect there'll be a lot of young Arabs and Turks maybe who know nothing about this at all, because it's not really something that is dwelled upon at any length. And in Morocco, it's quite taboo.
Do you think this is a generational thing? Like, will younger generations start trying to uncover these stories in the same way that you see younger generations being much more interested in this story in the West?
I think that's right. I think they will. And I think academics and books and also journalism has a role to play in this as well. But I've got a story in the book where an Arab woman, I think it was Sudan, married a black African, and it caused a sensation on social media, and so many of the comments she received were completely racist. What are you doing? My Arab queen marrying a slave, simply because the man was black. So I think that those attitudes equally persist as well. Whether they'll change or not with future generations, one would hope so, but difficult to predict. But I think you need to see more work to address the legacy, whether that is from historians, journalists, campaigners, politicians as well. I mean, the Mauritanian government, to me, seems to be pretty much in denial on this as well. They just want to cover it up rather than do anything meaningful against it. And we know that when slaves have been found and possibly liberated, and the slave owners have been taken to court, they're sentenced to meaningless sentences and virtually immediately released anyway. They don't even serve those sentences. So it's an indication that the government is not taking this seriously whatsoever. And that's a country which is often called the last stronghold of slavery.
So my last question, will we ever be rid of slavery?
Crikey. You'd hope so, wouldn't you? I mean, we're talking to each other in 2025. It's extraordinary, really, that we're having a lot of this conversation. But I have a nasty feeling that the answer probably is no, in the same way that, will we ever get rid of poverty? And that nasty expression, the poor will always be with us. I suppose the good thing to say would be that it's in really declining numbers, and even in a place like Mauritania, which we've talked about a little bit today, it is. I would say there are vestiges of slavery there rather than it being completely mainstream. But it's certainly a problem in Mali. It depends who you believe. It's either 20% or even up to 1 million people enslaved in Mali. Just not a country that is particularly written about in the English-speaking world. They have a huge amount of way to go before that problem is addressed. So you have a feeling that slavery will be with us for quite a while to come, at the very least, almost, if not forever.
Thank you for your time today, Justin. Captives and Companions did so much to fill in stories I've glimpsed in the Mediterranean and the Sahara. It's a fascinating read and an important one, and I hope my listeners pick it up.
Thanks so much, Ryan. A pleasure to talk to you today.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.